Welcome to wasmCloud Wednesday for September the 15th. As usual, we're going to start with the demo, and today we're going to be looking at the Kubernetes operator. I should probably give you privileges to share your screen. Jonathan, do you want to go ahead and maybe just give us start getting the verbal update? You're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, we initially started off with a Rust-based operator, and we're wondering about whether that was the best approach to go or not. So I created a POC to, well, a scaffolding out, I suppose, to actually go through and look at which way we really wanted to go in terms of direction. So what we settled out with was a operator based on Go, which uses Kube Builder to do some of the annotations and do the RBAC stuff, as well as get your test framework. And under the hood, it uses controller runtime to do really all the informers and the watchers that are abstracted away. The main reason for choosing this was to actually go through really the test framework. I think is much better in with the scaffolded out project. So when I look at the test, this is kind of how, this is not a complete implementation of the ORM spec, and what David and I settled on was actually to use the ORM spec in total, as opposed to, or its entirety, as opposed to picking and choosing pieces. So I started off the path of picking and choosing pieces because I wasn't sure whether we wanted to track all the drift that would happen in the spec, whereas we only use a subset. So what we're looking at here is my opinion at the moment, and it has changed obviously because there's a PR open and we can go to that as well. But basically I'm able to declare the entire spec here, and then that's in the before, and then the context, I am able to create the application, and then I eventually come back and actually look that it's actually created. That's really the gist of it. And then for the actual controller or the reconcile loop is really very simple. It just goes through, verifies that you have a payload, and then runs it. So if I go and run this test, which is in here, we'll actually just see a complete dump of the API server starting here, which is part of the test framework, and then going through its stuff and actually just dumping out the part that I'm interested in, which is just the spec here. So that's really what we settled on in terms of what to actually do. And then the PR actually takes both concepts and merges it together. So this is where we are right now in terms of what we've settled on in terms of using OM or not using OM. So here in the spec, we have chosen to use the complete specification as opposed to using a subset. So this is done to make sure that we really don't drift from it at all. And on the premise that it is easier to remove something as opposed to add something later. And then the controller itself is actually like very similar, but uses slightly different constructs. And so I'm just scrolling through to where it is. And this is refactored now, so it actually brings in the tests after some comments that are added in. So we're actually looking at setting up the tests here. And then also looking at how the reconcile loop is actually changed to bring stuff in. So some of the comments that I actually had was what pattern we really wanted to follow, because we want to make sure that we are able to add and remove the resource as we go along, and that requires a finalizer, and I guess that's not in here yet in terms of code, and we'll have to follow up on exactly what David and Ayush were actually thinking about there.
Yeah.
But, so like in simple terms, like, sorry.
I was just gonna say they're definitely thinking they should definitely use a finalizer for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, because some of the stuff here is probably not going to work out very well. But I mean, once we get the test set up, which it looks like they've actually scaffolded it out now, then it becomes very obvious on when or how and why you would actually use the finalizer, because basically the code doesn't execute if you don't say that you have a finalizer, which essentially says that the operator has something on the outside that it needs to monitor, and or that it really depends on to do its work, and then that's what its external worldview is, and that's what it really needs to reconcile. Yeah.
I guess the question is, how do you represent it, like a create and a delete? Like, how do you remove an application? How do you tell the lattice controller that you want an application to be removed?
Yeah, that was the question I had here of what application nil actually means. I haven't actually followed up with them to see what they actually want to do there.
I think that their initial plan was to like put the manifest in an envelope effectively, and send an empty envelope effectively to remove it. But we had a discussion today, and I think that the best thing potentially is to use almost like HTTP verbs, put and delete. So then that becomes the question: how do you represent that over NATS?
That was essentially going to be. So, I've been working on other stuff, so I haven't been able to publish or write down anything, but in my head, the spec for the wire protocol for the lattice controller is essentially going to be, there will be a topic for a dot put, and that's where the YAML goes for creating an application. And then there'll of course be a .del topic, and in there you can essentially pass just enough information that's that you need in order to delete the application, which would be the name and the version.
That sounds perfect. Yeah, I think that's a great way to do it.
And then there'll be some other functions that you can access through NATS topics, like you'll be able to query the materialized view that has the observed lattice state. So you'll be able to get the low-level state as well as high-level state, where we'll be monitoring the status of individual spread scalars and things like that.
Is that something you want to do periodically, it sounds like, or is it something you want to do just when like a resource is done? In terms of like once you do a CRUD operation using the KubeCon.
Well, my knowledge of Kubernetes operator framework stuff isn't really all that good, so I'm not sure.
So one option here is to actually do, like when you do a result, you can actually give it a time period that basically requeues your reconciler. And if that's the case, you can basically, it'll run through the whole loop over and over again. I mean, I've done it to do it at like 5 seconds when we're checking certain things, or 30 seconds or whatever, but I think I was actually checking for cert expiration, so it was probably more like 24 hours. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I just don't know what the vision is there for actually continuing to update the status on the operator itself. But the premise, doing it event-based, I think is a little bit harder, but doing it on timer-based is built in.
Yeah, so you'll be able to do both. With the lattice controller will publish events that are of interest when the status of an application changes, and you'll also be able to query the status of an application. But again, that's functionality that hasn't yet been implemented, but it should fit in pretty well with either a Kubernetes operator or any other consumer that wants to programmatically deploy applications.
Right. Another thing I was actually thinking about out loud, is there like any idea behind implementing something like XDS in terms of dynamic configuration, where you provide a hot load essentially, or what is, I guess, the premise for updating things on the fly, so to speak? Because right now we're very, very imperative in terms of we declare it and we run it through. But Wash, for example, actually does let you do things on the fly.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I haven't seen the lattice controller in terms of how it actually works, and it looks like
Well,
what
it
we're doing
hasn't
right
been-
now in
The lattice
terms of,
controller hasn't yet been implemented,
Right.
so.
sorry, yeah, point taken. But it looks like right now we are very much going towards the idea of essentially reading a config file, right? It's a post event, yeah, but essentially reading a config file where everything is declared up front. And I was wondering whether that was gonna be more configurable in the future, like looking at something like XDS, which is Envoy and gRPC now that implement for doing service mesh stuff, but it is a protocol, so to speak, that lets you do the dynamic configuration of like just change the provider as opposed to giving the whole post in its entirety. It's just a question of like what our thought process is behind there, and it doesn't necessarily have a definitive answer, but it's more what our direction is.
Well, I mean, there's certainly nothing off the table. Right now, the plan is to essentially get the MVP running. So if the shortest path to being able to get something in people's hands that they can actually play with and test is just having everything as a simple single declarative YAML file, then we can start there and then move to something more complex as necessary. I think one of the prevailing philosophies should be that we should only really adopt more complex patterns when we find we have a need for them. And so, starting simple and using the simplest possible version of it should allow us to get a lot of evidence and feedback on how it works the simple way, and then that should be able to inform our decisions in terms of how we support more complicated things, whether we want to support gRPC or anything else in the future.
I completely agree. Yeah, it's just more like where our heads are at in terms of what we think could happen in the future, which I guess in some terms
If you can,
does affect the decision. Yeah.
if you want to share, if you can share a link to the stuff that you're thinking about. I'm not sure. There's an acronym you mentioned that.
Yeah, XDS, which is just it's part of Envoy's configuration system.
Yeah, that's the trick. Is I don't want to. The lattice controller needs to remain agnostic, so it can't do things that are specific to Kubernetes or specific to Envoy, but we can certainly take inspiration from how other products are doing things. So yeah, if you could share a link to that.
Yeah, I can do that for sure.
Along the lines of some of the decisions we're making I can already hear a roadmap kind of emerging here on, what does MVP for this look like? So my first question is it worthwhile for us to maybe define a couple of, what would be in scope for MVP versus what might be, like a later release to include XDS and, secret store, I don't know, something along those lines as we move forward. Does that make sense for us to kind of define that a little bit and make sure that we can scope the work? Or, is the work just going to happen when the work happens? And I guess the tracking of the work is a little less critical. And maybe Steve, if you're on, if you don't mind, maybe speaking to that a little bit. You're sort of our, manager on the Cosmonic side here.
I'm going to stop sharing.
So was the question about MVP for the OTP host or MVP for Lattice controller?
MVP for Lattice controller.
Okay. Actually, I think Kevin could. I don't have a spec for that right now.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe it makes sense, Kevin, to make sure that your MVP lines up with the operator MVP from a feature set. It may be worthwhile us spending a little time here or someplace else, just lining up the notes, or this is a question. Do you feel that the RFC process you guys have kind of done has enough detail here that you guys are going to line up and on the feature sets?
Well, I think that's actually what we're doing right now, is having these discussions in the community meeting and in Slack and on pull requests and so on, where, you know, we will get the bare minimum functioning in order to start being able to have a fully integrated, you know, test between the Kubernetes operator and the Lattice controller. And then, you know, once the MVP for both of those is functioning, then we can start running some tests and figure out where we want to go from there. But I don't think we're at a point where we can figure out what our roadmap looks like, because we just haven't built enough yet.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate that. And then Jonathan, does that line up with your understanding as well? Janetha, sorry.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's build it as you go, but also to your point, I think keep the customer in mind. It's probably good to give them a vision of where we think we're going to. So communicate that. And like,
Stuart, you know, your team with the great demo you guys have been working on, I think really prioritize this work on the roadmap a little bit. You know, what do you does where we are now sound like we're aligned with, you know, something that's going to plug into the demo well, you know, to support that work going forward first? And then my second question, let me stop there and then ask my second question.
No, I think it definitely does. In that demo, we had a script loop running in the background. That was so as we brought up a new host, it knew what to do. Yeah, this will definitely fix that, and I think we're reasonably well aligned now. I think the missing bit for David and Ayush this morning was like, how do you represent a creation of the resource and a deletion of the resource? But I think the .del and .put is great. So I think they can probably pick that up tomorrow and just run with Janetha to get the operator done.
Okay, and then my next question is, and I'm definitely not trying to boil the ocean here. It's really just more of a fit the turtles in my head. Would kubevela then be able to drive the Kubernetes wasmCloud operator, which could then drive the Lattice controller, which would then drive the Lattice to drive wasmCloud? Is that the, you know, kubevela feels like broad, it can deploy to Kubernetes, to Lambda, to all the different things here. Is that how this would fit together, you know, in a proposed stack?
I think in the future, we need to make sure that we don't clash with kubevela, but I think we've done that with a different group version in Kine. For now, I think we're planning to be completely independent of it, apart from, I believe they are using a part of kubevela as a library to do the OAM validation. The schema,
they're bringing in the entire spec basically, because it's implemented and it's just there as a package. So,
which I think it makes sense to. I mean, like that product came out of the cross-plane sort of like family, and OAM as I think it's all part of the same thing. So I think it makes sense to reuse that code, and I think that the version v1 alpha 1, which is what they're on at the moment, you know, if they change that spec, they'll move to v1 alpha 2, I guess, or v1 beta 1 or whatever. So we should be protected from that.
Okay.
So I think it's safe to use their code for that part of it, which is a good
thing. I like it for a couple of reasons. I like if we're making this investment and there's a broader vision in the overall Kubernetes ecosystem, that if we're importing, you know, that piece of the OEM model from them, that we hopefully be compatible with their implementation, so that we would plug in as a potential provider into the greater ecosystem. For me, like the whole push to Kubernetes is, you know, less around I think wasmCloud has powerful use cases with Kubernetes, and it's where the customers are today. Let me say it as a positive, not a negative. So it's being where the customers are today, and if part of the being around OAM and the Kubernetes operators and what we're trying to align to is this greater kubevela story for the org, then, you know, like maybe part of the medium-term roadmap should be to officially plug in as a provider there. And I'm just suggesting that, not trying to say that's a requirement, or more just trying to understand if that should be a requirement is perhaps where I'm going with it.
Yeah, I mean, the operator is like 2 bits, isn't it? It's like watching the application model manifest and then sending it to the lattice controller. I think the first bit, kubevela, does that already, but doesn't do the second bit. And we want to be independent of kubevela in case you don't want to run kubevela. We don't want to tie into that. So I think the operator needs to stand alone on its own, but it's possible that it could also act as a like backend for kubevela. So kubevela could do the operator part of it, and we just do the nats push.
Got it. Okay, all right, then I think in my head anyway, I can at least see how the turtles might stack up in the Yertle the turtle Kubernetes stack here. So I don't have any other further questions about this, except to say it's just awesome to see the work happening. Anyone else on this?
I wanted to follow up on Janitha's comment. Just you said that you wanted an opportunity to give feedback on the spec, and that's absolutely the way we work. So the reason you haven't seen a spec isn't because we're gonna like spec it and build it and release it all at once. It's just because in the timeline we're not up to spec yet, but the spec doesn't mean it's done, and we definitely want to get feedback from you and people in the community. So you'll definitely see it and get a chance to give feedback. We really love the feedback from all you guys who are working on this.
Awesome. All right, great. Well, let's maybe slide on to some community news. So we got a lot of fun events planned over the next few weeks. We have not committed to a release date on 0.50 yet, but we believe that early next week will be, somewhat feature complete. We're trying to finish up our demos for KubeCon, which are due October the 1st. But once we have a little bit more insight into what that demo is going to finish out like for our talks, then we're going to schedule the release party. So it may slip to first week of October, but that would be fine for us because we'd be then coming into KubeCon week with something building up. There's going to be 2 episodes of Cloud Native TV that we're going to be on. One is going to be a WebAssembly 101, and the second one is going to be somewhat of an overview discussion panel around the challenges facing early developers, featuring our Red Badger friends. So super excited about those community events. A couple other little notes. If no one saw, the DS Lab team just released their WAGI stuff here, which is the WebAssembly gateway interface. So somebody made the joke about WA Perl being next to see this come out. But I think what's really interesting about this is if Microsoft is going to start supporting this in Azure anywhere, even in a limited functionality. They actually demoed this like a year ago. So it's been out for a while, but to see them actually do a PR and some external momentum on it means to me that they want to start doing some testing. So I think that'll be interesting to see what comes to fruition there. And then WASM Day, we're just full steam ahead. Registrations are picking up. We have a handful of reporters, like a gaggle of reporters have all kind of come together, and we've got some good high profile registrations there. So I think we're all set. I'm not sure if there's any other community news that we would want to highlight. Anyone? So open call there. All right, Steve, I think we transition over to the ZenHub board. I don't know if you want to share your screen and just show what we've got left. You're on mute, Steve.
Thank you. Hello. So we are testing is the remaining work. We're functionally complete. We're doing a documentation walkthrough. I posted a link yesterday on the Slack channel with draft documentation, and there's a couple updates we need to do to that. We're pushing releases to Docker Hub and k8s.io and the OCI registry. So it's kind of a rolling release that's starting today, and will go over the next few days. So I'll continue to post updates on Slack with the progress. Should be a documentation update to wasmCloud.dev by today or tomorrow.
All right, that's awesome, Steve. Any questions on roadmap stuff or concerns about 0.50? Any thoughts if we should go to market with the 50-cent release? Anybody? I tried to like GIF up something, and it just felt like I was in like the, you know, like it was just terrible. I'm just, I mean, it wasn't even close to good. I couldn't find a reasonable GIF like for the in the club or anything like that that I thought we could hijack. The best thing I found was a sparkly a 50-cent sign, but it wasn't even that great. Maybe the price is right. Oh, that's what we should do. You pull the pole down and it spins the wheel, and then there's like, you know, the land on $1. We could land on 50 cents. That's the GIF I got to get. Okay, all right. Solve my own problem with that one. Open floor. Anything else anybody wants to bring up, or I don't know if we'll finish up a little early today. Stuart, anything coming off mute?
Sorry, no, nothing at all. That's great.
Kaushik, anything?
Exciting.
Anything on your side?
Nope, nothing from me. Got some stuff planned for a next round of release for the JS library, mainly getting away from the WAPC stuff, but nothing planned at the moment.
Okay, that sounds exciting. All right, last call. We'll go and stop. We can hang out for a little bit. All right, everybody have a great Wednesday.